This concept here in Germany called an opening ball, which I think is a really an interesting German phrase. But essentially, it's the first time that a team will try and break the line. The build-up phase actually was higher than what Manchester City managed. So they're kind of specifically looking at a certain way to press them.
Sit deeper, be more compact. Make sure that Man City can't play through you. So in Wolves' case, how would you measure that compact? Can you measure that compactness of the team? Can you measure their sort of defensive stability?
The real value add to using data within football is for recruitment. So there are certain value adds that you can have for analysis, but I think what he meant was that the upside is just incredible from a recruitment side of things. If you can get it right and not sign a dud, that makes such a difference. You can also look at what role they fit. Trent was a far better fit to create a right back role actually than Reece James was, but Reece James was also a very high match to the right wing back profile. And we can look at who is the best right back within our system.
Can you go back to 1998, Robert? Because I think I might be in the top 1,000.
Man City seemed to struggle to break the defensive line of Wolves in this match, and Wolves actually took more defenders out of the game than Manchester City did.
Welcome, football fans, to Breaking Lines, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the beautiful game like never before. I'm Gary Rowett, former player and manager, joined by the insightful Dave Carolan, a man with his finger on the pulse of football's beating heart. Together, Dave and I bring you unrivaled insight, context, and a few stories from the trenches. This is Breaking Lines, where the game is more than just a match.
Robert, I don't know if you're able to show us the platform itself and show how, for those people listening, probably it's not going to be a great description, but certainly for those people who can see this on YouTube, to show us how the platform is actually utilized and maybe what that interface looks like that clubs are going to use, head coaches, analysts, or whoever in the club, when they're working with IMPECT, see the platform, because it is so different from probably every other platform that's out there, whether it's a Stats Bomb or whether it's an Opta, Y-Scout. So I don't know if you're able to give us a description of the platform now.
Yeah, just I suppose we can share a little bit without getting in too much trouble. We have essentially two different platforms, I would say, from a web interface perspective. We have an analysis platform and a scouting platform. The scouting platform is also available on a mobile app for people who scout and go into stadiums. We also have a separate glossary, which kind of houses our API, which is how people would access our raw data and then maybe create their own metrics and build things into their own club portal or platform. But even the kind of most advanced clubs, they'll still use our platforms to get some quick answers. So first of all, with analysis, I guess very basic overview. You can come in and you can see the last matches, and you can see some of the data that we collect. I guess we can't go into the detail about every single one of these, but you've got some of our expected measures. So expected threat, which is kind of our overall model that looks at each individual action in the game, and different types of expected goals, whether it's a non-shot based model, which gives a value to actions that maybe aren't actual shots, but basically say, well, what if the player would have shot in that scenario? How valuable was it? A normal shot-based expected goals and a post-shot expected goals, which looks at the finishing quality of a team. Obviously, we can see here Manchester City look quite good in this game. That's ranked against the rest of the league this season. So of all 158 Premier League performances as of this date, their expected goal score ranks 54th of 158. So it's a high-level performance. That probably tells you a little bit about how the game panned out, but obviously we can come down here and look in a bit more of a nuanced way, the pack-in data. How did we get into those shooting positions? And quite an interesting game, to be quite honest. We mentioned before the idea of bypassing opponents and bypassing defenders and removing opponents with ball wins. This is what we call a radar chart. It allows you to look at how well a team has performed again against the rest of the league. You can see here Manchester City, by no surprise, were far more progressive, bypassing more opponents than Wolves in this game. Interestingly, though, and I guess if anybody who watched the game, it would be quite interesting to know that Man City seemed to struggle to break the defensive line of Wolves in this match. And Wolves actually took more defenders out of the game than Manchester City did. Now, we define defenders as the deepest 5 players at any given moment. Bypassing opponents can be any individual player, whether it's, Haaland or Bernardo Silva from Man City. But if you take the defenders out of the game, that in theory should lead to you scoring more goals. And we always use that correlation to the end result that we mentioned at the start as our proof of concept. Then that individual KPI, bypassing defenders, actually is the highest correlation in terms of winning a football match. So that tends to be the bottom line. And I would say that Wolves can count themselves quite unlucky in this game. One thing I should mention in the spirit of being able to make sure that everybody can understand the data, these are quite in-depth terms. Some people who haven't had a presentation from us, who haven't got a background in data, might not understand them. We always have a football language that kind of translates that into the data language. So it essentially just describes what we're measuring. So instead of bypassing opponents, it measures your ball progression, breaking of the opposition defense as opposed to bypass defenders, offensive interventions instead of removing opponents with ball wins. So it breaks it down into maybe a bit more of a football language that everybody should be able to understand. You can also look at that across the entire game for each of these individual KPIs. So we can look at how often the defensive line was broken by each individual team. Man City have started strong in the game, but throughout different moments, other teams were stronger. Obviously, towards the end, a bit of an onslaught from Man City, bypassing 6 more defenders than Wolves did from the 76th minute onwards. So, unfortunately, it probably led to the downfall. Without going into all the nuances of this, you've also got the phase of play. We go into more detail than I suppose what's typically seen as one team in possession or another. We break it down into transitional phases, structured possession phases, second ball and set piece phase. Interestingly, Man City, I think that's our 4th highest in the league this season. They spent 50% of the game in a structured possession, so they absolutely dominated. But you then might want to know, okay, in what phase did they create the chances from? Man City were very strong at creating XG from in possession phases, no surprise, and set piece. But Wolves were actually very strong from transitional moments. So again, breaking it down into that sort of nuanced idea of maybe what Wolves' game plan was can give you more of an idea about whether they got it right, because just an overall idea of who had the highest XG might not particularly be what you're looking for. Wolves might have been able to at least create the chances in the phases that they want.
That's fascinating in itself, isn't it? Because most armchair fans would see possession produced as 2 absolutely polar numbers, wouldn't they? One team at 60%, one team at 40%, because it has to equal 100% of each team either in possession. But certainly in terms of this and the phases of the game, it tells you a completely different story, that actually in the whole game, Wolves only had 13% controlled possession, and there was far more time for them spent in the transitional phases of the game than in the control phase of the game.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we alluded to there before. Not every team wants to play in the same way. They might have both executed their game plans to a certain degree of competency, and I can imagine based on from how the match panned out, despite the fact that they were worse off for XG, Wolves were probably quite happy with how they played in that game in some ways. I think they hit a lot of what they believed to have been their key data points they would have seen from it. So again, describing different styles of play is important. Of course, there's other things we can go into as well. I guess we spoke a little bit about pressure, which is probably another good thing to look into. I'm not sure if anybody really associates Man City as being a high pressure style of team. However, you can sort of see from this radar chart they were very, very strong in pressing in different areas. There's a lot of detail in here, so I won't go into all of it. But you can see that Wolves are far more nuanced in terms of how they want to put pressure on. So they don't have a very high pressure height, for example. They're not going to pressure the opposition goalkeeper very often. However, the pressure on Man City during their build-up phase actually was higher than what Manchester City managed. So they're kind of specifically looking at a certain way to press them. On that build-up phase, you can come into that tab and you can kind of see why that was the case. We have this concept here in Germany called an opening ball, which I think is a really an interesting German phrase. We don't really have a translation in English, so we call it an opening ball. But essentially, it's the first time that a team will try and break the line. So, as opposed to looking at PPDA and looking at every single pass, we're now looking at, okay, when a person actually tries to break the line from the team, have you been able to put pressure on that individual pass? Because that probably is what you're trying to do if you're pressing the opposition. There's no point running after everybody like a headless chicken for them then to be able to play around your press, give it to the left back who's got acres of space and able to play a pass that he wants. If you're able to put them into a pressing trap that allows you to press the way that they're trying to build up and progress the ball, that's great. And we can see Wolves actually managed to press a large amount of Manchester City's opening balls when they tried to break the line, which is always a really good thing to see. So putting it into this context is I think always key. Just the total number of pressures or PPDA is often missing the point, I would say.
Robert, Gary O'Neill's just texted me and just said, is there a VAR measurement in this model? That's what he wants to know if the referees have the same statistical analysis. It's so interesting, isn't it? When you look at the way that you present it and you look at so many metrics that you would use. For some people, they would see very limited metrics on a game live. But of course, there's so many other things to look at and there's so many ways of looking at it. I think the interesting bit about it is that you can't see, people have to take into consideration each coach's tactical game plan going into the game, don't they? Because if you just look at the data, it can always look like one team's so much better than another team at certain things. But actually, in Wolves' case, for example, in this instance, I would imagine it was sit deeper, be more compact, make sure that Man City can't play through you. So in Wolves' case, how would you measure that can you measure that compactness of the team? Can you measure their sort of defensive stability? Because in a game like this, that would be absolutely crucial to them, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that you'll know better than I. Teams aren't soft. They don't go into games thinking, we're playing against Man City there. We're in for a hide-in. We'll just sit back and be timid. They have a real game plan, and that's what they want. So to be able to measure that is absolutely fine. And of course, Man City, you're going to have more attempts on goal and maybe a higher XG in general because they take a few shots from certain areas. But they'll have their own KPIs that will describe that. The way that I would probably look at it is essentially that defensive line breaks, how often the opposition manages to break your defence. Interestingly, they've really, really minimised Man City's performance in this. If you can look at this across the entire season. At the moment, I'm logged in as Man City. You can probably look at the seasonal development and you can look at how often they've managed to be able to penetrate the opposition defence. Okay, maybe they've not been as strong this season. We can all remember the Arsenal game where they were very, very compact. It was around about the same level as them. So I would say that they will come out of this having only had 30 of their own defenders taken out of the game. And they would say, do you know what? I think we've probably done a good job. We've managed to stifle Man City's attack. Of course, Man City found a way in the end, but there are teams that will look at it and say, okay, if we can look at it and keep it to only 30 suffered bypass defenders, as we'd usually call this from a data language perspective, then that's probably where we want to be for today. That's about our goal within this game. So 100%. To be honest, it's quite topical, I suppose. We look at it very often with different teams. I remember when Tuchel first came into Chelsea, he had a reputation, I suppose, for playing very attacking football, very fluid football, and I suppose everybody wanted to see maybe a replication of the Dortmund team or something along those lines. The first thing he fixed was the defence of the team. I remember sitting down and going through it with them, essentially that it was the best in regards to a team having their defensive line broken of any team in the top 5 leagues that we had on record at the time. And I think it's only been equalled by Arsenal last season in the Premier League since then, of an average of, I think, 30 suffered bypass defenders per game. These benchmarks, I think, are really crucial in being able to actually measure the team's defensive performance and how solid they are. Not to say that every team needs to sit back like Wolves have done here, but it's a way of also winning games that obviously needs to be measured.
It's really interesting because I saw a quote on your website, which I've seen previously from Tuchel, and I thought it'd be interesting, for England fans to have an understanding of what to expect. But he said, our players always got it when we presented your data. This is not rocket science. I think what he's obviously trying to say is, again, players can understand this data because it feels real to them. And that doesn't mean to say that other data providers aren't doing the same or trying to do the same. But I think that's the thing. It has a real flavour of every action that I achieve or do as a player. It's being judged in a performance way, So I think one of the things that you guys are doing at the moment, I mean, I'm pretty sure I've remembered this correctly, but, for example, if I'm a defender and I get beaten, sometimes that, in some ways, that would go down as my poor play, my poor defender. But actually, some of it now you're trying to measure, have I been left isolated as a defender? Has somebody else been in a poor position? You'd sort of give us a little flavour of that type of thing, how you sort of measuring positional play as well as a defender.
Yeah, I suppose there's a few different ways in which we can go into it. And just in terms of the general data landscape, the way that we collect the data, it's event level data. So we'll be looking at events that can be seen that happen either on the ball or can be tagged like an action, like a pressure, for example. So again, you can't look at all of the context. And some clubs will have tracking data, which will look at where every single player is on the pitch at a time, and they can come up with a far better answer to this type of thing, I would say, and that's definitely the right approach to go through. Problem is that generally tracking data is only available for your own team or your own league, and therefore when you want to try and recruit a player and be able to look at them in the same level of detail as you have in your own centre-back, you're kind of left with no answers. So we've developed a couple of approaches. I suppose the first thing we look at is when a player receives a ball, we look at how much pressure they're under. So is it the case that they were given an undue amount of pressure, something that would be very difficult to control the ball and not lose it? Because typically it's kind of a black and white situation. If I pass the ball to Dave and it comes to him at chest height, and Gary,
if it goes to him at foot height, Robert, he's gonna lose it anyway. What sort of height would chest height be for Dave?
About knee height for a normal human.
Well, a separate scale today. If I give him a horrible pass, essentially, there's a few different things that we measure. And you're stood just a couple of feet behind him, Gary. You come through and win the ball because he's only able to take a horrible touch. Generally, within data, they'll say, that's Dave's fault. He touched it last. We think that well, I would sure Dave would have something to say about that. It's just nonsensical. It doesn't have the context of the situation. So using the pressure that we've measured, the amount of pressure the player is under, we have a scale from 0 to 100%. We would essentially give the amount of pressure that I put him under as the amount of blame that I should receive. So it gives a more contextual idea of who is at fault. I guess probably more relating to what you've mentioned is probably quite a difficult thing to explain. We have this concept of packing zones, and packing zones essentially look at the pitch based on where the opposition has stood, as opposed to the rigid pitch markings of have you had a touch in the box or the final third or whatever. We'll say, have you had a touch in behind the opposition centre-backs? Have you had a touch between the opposition midfield and centre-backs? We have different areas to describe based on where they are stood. And from that, we've essentially modelled how often do the areas that we're responsible as defenders get exposed, get attacks into that area. We use our own model, our expected threat model, to look at how much threat is generated by the opposition in areas that we are responsible for. So, for example, if I'm playing right back, the area in behind me will very often be a large amount my fault if the opposition are able to create a chance in that area. So as opposed to kind of tarring everybody with the same brush, we're able to put it down as, okay, it's kind of the area that he's responsible for. That being said, again, there's never a way of really measuring defending in a perfect way. And data is a long way away from being able to do that. It might have come a long way since, sounds like from what you were being assessed on, Gary, but I'm sure you're already thinking there's plenty of nuanced ways where you can go further into that and say, well, was the reason why I was exposed as a right back because I've been told to push forward? And that's where scouts come in and analysts come in and they can say, well, there's a reason for that. There's a kind of a yin and yang. He's creating some sort of progression up the pitch. He's going to, allow some people to get in behind him. Let's make sure that we interpret the data properly to understand that he's not a terrible defender just because he's allowing players into that area. The system of the team is meaning that essentially he's going to leave himself exposed at times. We're trying to answer it as best as possible, shall we say.
When you said Dave's poor touch, I could see Dave thinking in his head, that's just not going to happen. there's no way a poor touch is happening, because they've definitely has produced some good performances in training as a number 10 occasionally, unopposed though, Robert, with very little pressure. Are you seeing a rise in? I know you've got a new part of, or you're improving a part of the model around set pieces. Have you seen a lot more clubs wanting more data around set pieces? We've seen set piece coaches become very topical at clubs. Are you seeing a lot more people asking for more around that sort of data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the main reasons why we added this kind of set piece module within the platform for set piece coaches mostly, and the people responsible for them within clubs to analyze games. It's massive because the game, thankfully, is dynamic. It's fluid. It's very difficult to measure in a way that can be replicated around the pitch. Set pieces are kind of separate to that. So especially, I guess penalties is one of the ways in which you can very simply understand what's the chance of me scoring this penalty. The next step along that line is probably something like a corner, where to a certain extent, there are some certainties. Things happen that generally always happen, and we can measure corners consistently in terms of then how they're executed. Are they in swinging? Are they out swinging? Have they aimed at the near post, at the far post? And look at essentially the success rate of what a team wants to do, whether it's first contact, whether it's getting a shot on goal. I think it's probably the biggest win that a team can make now, and it does obviously have some impact on a game model, but to a certain extent, it can be separate from what a team wants to do. I think Arsenal have been a really great example of that, where they've used the tools that they've got at their disposal of basically Gabriel, who's incredible in the air, and they've looked at ways in which they can get him into, I'm sure Charles Hughes would call that the position of maximum opportunity and an area in front of goal, and it seems very difficult to stop him. That's one way in order to execute a corner really well. So I can't see it stopping. It's probably the biggest value add at the moment when it comes to increasing your team's chances of scoring. I think people often forget how many corners happen in games as well, and it's often just been thought of as an afterthought. But it's something you can really add a lot of value to.
Robert, what about things like throw-ins? I was involved in a game recently where there were 50 throw-ins, and we've seen that, Liverpool in the past have employed a throw-in coach. Is that another part of the game which is receiving attention within the platform, or is that something that's going to be developed?
Yeah, so it's something that we, maybe to go into the detail of the product, I think we added free kicks and corners in a very detailed way last month, and throw-ins is being developed now. When it comes to adding a sort of new arm of the product, so to speak, we need to be able to create KPIs that describe essentially what's happened in the game. And throw-ins, again, was something that was very often ignored, I would say, from a data perspective. Although there have been some trailblazers, obviously, you've alluded to there what happened at Liverpool, and obviously at some other clubs, that they've been able to really understand what happens in a throw-in and know that retaining possession is a really important thing that goes into it. Our product development team is I guess, working hard at the moment in terms of being able to bucket them into different areas. It's I would say quite an important thing to be able to look into as well. And I'm sure that at some point within the future, it will be the case that throwing coaches will be the norm within football clubs, specifically in the Premier League, when there's a budget there, and any value add, any marginal gain that they can find will be the most important thing for them.
So Robert, how much do you guys have to move? I mean, of course you have to, but how much do you have to move with a game? When you see game styles change and evolve and adjust, does that affect some of the ways you have to move forward with the data, the way you would maybe contextualize some of that data? For example, we spoke about provoking the press. That changes the way you view just passes at the back, and do you know what I mean? So do you have to move, is there anything specific you think you have to move with, or you have to adjust?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we mentioned it before, the game ebbs and flows in terms of technical trends and how people want to play. We've got our best ideas from the clubs that we work with, and they'll often come to us. Look, it sounds very sad, but we often lie awake at night here thinking about ways in which we can improve the way we measure the game. And we spend probably far too much time doing that. Certainly would be the case if you ask my wife. And yet, despite us spending so much time, people within football clubs who are working in different environments, that are working on certain things that they want to measure, will throw something to us very often in kind of an off-the-cuff way. Like, have you thought about measuring this? Thought about doing that? And you'll think, God, I thought I was obsessed with football. Why have I not thought about that? And that would be massive. That would be a real value add to a lot of different clubs. So that's generally been the way in which we've developed the product. I mean, one of them, just over the last summer, very basic one, was a club's goalkeeper coach was hand coding for penalty shootouts which way their opposition goalkeeper was diving most often. And I guess that's just a normal thing that's been going on for years. And yet, to my knowledge, most data providers weren't really providing that. We're thinking, why? It's not much to do. Why did we not add that? Why is that not something we can do to help? So any feedback that we get from people within the game is most often the way in which we find a way to improve. And as tactical trends change, the data will change with it as well. We always want to remain relatively agnostic to the style, not tell anybody this is the right way to play, at least from a blank script perspective, and only be able to measure what's happening in the match. And I'm sure there'll be a different vogue formation or way of playing in 10 years' time. Hopefully we'll have made steps by that point to be able to measure that as well as it materializes.
I've got one to add to your penalty data, Robert. I was in a seminar the other day, and actually most of the penalties missed in the last major competition were down to the time it took the penalty taker to take the penalty. So I think it was something like over 8 seconds, and there was something like a swing of about 30% chance of missing. So actually there's evidence to suggest if your goalkeeper can find ways to put the player off, like Martinez has done brilliantly, that actually has a bigger effect than, obviously you want all the information, but there's so many interesting things. And as a manager, it was the first time I thought, really, I didn't really understand that. I would presume that maybe the longer, the more composed player, but there's so many little trends that start to develop that you hear about that are, absolutely fascinating. So yeah, I won't charge you for that one.
I'm sure there'll be some sort of middle ground. That's kind of the problem with data. If you take it as an approach to say, okay, people who've taken so long to take a penalty often miss. Some people might interpret that to say, well, we've got to take all our penalties as quickly as possible. So run, get the ball, put it on the spot and sprint and take a shot. You need to add the context of what goes into it. And of course, the kind of the problem with modeling this type of thing is you need a large amount of data to be able to understand it. I guess just one individual tournament very often isn't enough really to glean many insights from. There aren't that many penalties taken. It's kind of been the problem with expected goals over the years in terms of not being able to put them into different buckets of, is it a long shot? Is it a shot from short distance, et cetera, et cetera. So the sample size is always a really important thing to consider. And often, unfortunately, we just don't have enough data to be able to provide meaningful answers to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you start looking at the development of, everywhere from Charles Hughes to where we are now to where it's going to go in the future. I mean, it is the future of football in a lot of ways, isn't it? And we can only see the exponential rise in the amount of people involved in this side of the game over the last number of years. And it brings us to recruitment, because now when it comes to recruitment, it's not just, a scout's gone, likes the look of the player, like that's seen the Moneyball, somebody who can get on base. Now we want so much more information around the player, how he fits the coach's model, the game plan, or the club's game model. You guys must be in that realm as well, starting to create a narrative around other aspects of the game outside of how far someone can run, how many passes they complete, and so on. The scouting side must be big as well.
100%. I think actually feeding off somebody who knows far more than me within the world of data and football, Ian Graham, the one that used to run data at Liverpool. I remember one of the things that he presented, I think it was our conference, he spoke about the real value add to using data within football is for recruitment. So there are certain value adds that you can have for analysis, but I think what he meant was that the upside is just incredible from a recruitment side of things. If you can get it right and not sign a dud, that makes such a difference. And being able to understand that obviously comes with its challenges, but in the end, I think that the end positives that come from it are almost non-ending compared to if you were to, waste money on an individual player. I'm sure you've experienced in the past, and you feel like, you've got no way of playing the way you want to. So shall I share a little bit of the scouting platform? Does that make sense?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that'd be great.
So maybe very, very simply, in terms of how we would look at an individual player, there is always an individual player profile on the platform, and you can look at their season so far. We then have an overall score. So there's what we call the IMPECT score. This is a kind of a one-size-fits-all idea of what goes into a right back. I always think this is a nice way of being able to measure the effectiveness of a player and how well they've played in general. But right back's probably a good place to start. There's a multitude of different types of right back. And what Trent Alexander-Arnold does well, somebody else, Seamus Coleman, might do something different particularly well. That's a kind of a different skill set. And it kind of matters what the coach wants and what the team wants in general. So this IMPECT model, it looks at historically when a player's been on the pitch, how often does the team go on to in the game when they put a performance in data-wise like Trent Alexander-Arnold has done. And we put it into a score from 0 to 100%. It's an individual score other than that, but this is just a percentile as we call it. You can see over here, however, on the right-hand side, that we then put that into positional profiles. Because as we mentioned, there are different things that different fullbacks or different players will do. We've got our own default profiles. One being the creative right back, and Trent Alexander-Arnold is a really high fit to this creative right back profile. You can sort of see what goes into it in terms of what we believe a creative right back should be doing with some of these individual KPIs. So how often they progress the ball, bypassing opponents, their ability to hit diagonal passes and low passes, etc. However, generally how a club would use this, I would say in terms of best practice, is that they will sit down on the platform and they'll create their own profile. And they'll go through with whoever is in charge of the game model and they'll say, okay, based on what we want, what should a right back be doing? This, and this. I think that clubs that really use data in a high value way, they'll be able to do it in a far more specific way than what we have on the platform. They'll be able to take the raw data and model it into a far greater tool to be able to use it. But this is, I think, a really nice way to be able to measure it and say, okay, he's a really great creative right back, but maybe we want something that he just isn't producing. So for us, Trent Alexander-Arnold isn't really the guy for us. On top of that, we can look at then how he's played each individual match, whether it's based on the IMPECT score or based on our individual profiles. So, if we wanted a creative right back, maybe Trent Alexander-Arnold was a great match to that against Bournemouth, as an example. And then, of course, you can go through here and look at how the player has performed individually compared to everybody else within his peer group within the league that season. So, for example, bypassing of defenders, it looks like he ranks as the highest. You can see how he's bypassed defenders. So obviously with a low pass, he's particularly good. But you can also just look at where he ranks compared to the other right backs in the league. And he's first with 9. Interestingly, Christopher Ayer, this must be all fullbacks, is it? Is ranked second place. I guess he's done pretty well when he's been pushed out there for Brentford this season. And you can also see that per individual game. So, yeah, so quite a nice way to be able to look at it.
So, Robert, could a club come to you and say, right, for example, we're looking for a creative right back. Could you give us the best 20 rank? And if, let's say it was Man City, can you give us the best 20 creatively ranked right backs on your system? Is that something that they could do so they could now start to narrow down that search? Is that how a lot of clubs would use it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can do that yourself within the market screening tool on here. So maybe without showing anything too recent, we can go into the Premier League for a few seasons ago, and we'll look at right backs, and we can look at who is the best right back within our system.
Can you go back to 1998, Robert? Because I think I might be in the top 1,000 if you can possibly do that.
Unfortunately not. Just that we haven't got any data for Dave in training. We haven't got any data on you, Gary. Now, so this obviously shows the IMPECT score of these players, but you can also look at what role they fit. Trent was a far better fit to create a right back role actually than Reece James was, but Reece James was also a very high match to the right wing back profile. So he's kind of able to do both. He's maybe an amalgamation of both here. So I'd say Azpilicueta also playing that role very well for Chelsea. Your Cancelo being a creative right back, but you'll find somebody else that probably plays a completely different profile in general. Joel Veltman apparently that season was more of a classic fullback. But the general way of doing it is you would create your own profile and you would say, okay, let's come up with our ideal right back that does this, 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 and this. And it will be able to tell you then, based on the markets that you've decided to look in, who is the best player for that individual role. Maybe the final way in which you'd then be able to compare this is by looking at the players' performances against the team, or the standard that your team is playing in at the time. So we have this overall league model, which essentially ranks the standard of each individual team at that given time. Funnily enough, I guess it doesn't really have much to do with our data. It's based on the closing line of the betting market, but it will essentially give you an idea of, okay, has my player played particularly well against somebody who would be a top ranking team in the Premier League, or a team that would, only be in the lower echelons of the Bundesliga or La Liga, because that's really nothing compared to what we're going to face in the Premier League. So if I go for just a player who's moved from the Eredivisie, I'm sure we all can remember a few players who've cut the mustard and those that haven't in the Eredivisie. I think it's always interesting to look at how they've transported themselves. So Luis Sinistera, I guess, doing well now at Bournemouth. He was very good for Feyenoord in the Eredivisie. We can use this opponent level feature to essentially bucket the clubs into different standards. So, for example, teams like KC Valwijk, they will be, probably League One standard, being very honest. Certainly nothing like Premier League standard clubs. We have got some teams of that season that he played against were low, average, and high standard Premier League teams, none of them quite to the caliber of Man City or Liverpool. But the general idea is, okay, we look at his performances against those top level teams and we see whether he's been able to replicate that performance. Because very often you'll see that players play well against these very poor teams within an Eredivisie because they are at the standard of League One. And that says, okay, he'd probably do well playing in League One. If you're looking at somebody who wants to play in the Premier League, these are the games that matter. So we can see, nice story for Luis Sinistera. I guess we would have predicted that he would have done quite well in the Premier League. His performance level remained across the board particularly high. That's a very crude way of looking at it. There's far more nuanced ways in which you can factor in opposition level and maybe the direct opponent and the game state of the match. But this is a nice original way of essentially screening the market to try and find those players that are able to perform against teams that are kind of similar to yours in terms of standard.
I mean, that's just fascinating, isn't it? The level of depth that you go into, the ability to weigh up individuals across different leagues across the world and being able to compare them to the standard that you want to recruit for has got to be a real godsend for those in recruitment who are trying under immense pressure from not only the fan base who want to recruit good players, but they have to also be answerable to a budget and to a club who want to make sure that every pound has got more than just its equivalence in return for value. It's got to hopefully then develop, especially when it's young players, in accruing value for the club. So something like this is probably going to be invaluable for those in recruitment to be able to, know that they've done the depth of research and analysis that they should do.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, data is never going to provide the answer to the question. Thankfully, I don't think football will ever be that simple, but it should maybe allow you to as somebody within a recruitment department, spend less time filtering out players that probably we should never have a look at. If the data can basically narrow your shortlist down far more, you can spend more time watching the players that are probably more interesting for you. I would hope that no club would ever just look at a player at the top of a shortlist that's been created from data and say, let's sign him. He's the guy. You've got to be able to watch him and see how he will be able to fit the system, because the data is essentially just describing a little bit how they play. It doesn't necessarily give you the nuances that somebody who's an expert in football would understand. But in the end of the day, it's going to be a far more efficient process if you use data within in that way.
I think it's really important, isn't it? Because there'd be a lot of fans out there around the transfer window, screaming at the team, why have we not signed a player yet? Or why have we not done business? And I think it's really important to everyone to understand that, these departments at football clubs, there's so much detail and there's so much time spent in this preparation, trying to pick the ideal player. And it's not easy just to make a quick decision, isn't it? Because, there's so much information to go through, and it's so important to get it right. And like you say, you can't always measure the decision making of that player. You can't always measure the character of that player, of how he's going to act when his team's 2-0 down. You can't always measure that sort of leadership qualities of a player. This is just that objective measure, but is obviously, it's so contextual, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. There's so many other parts to the game as well.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, to be honest, it probably just allows you to mitigate that short-termism that probably used to exist in a football club, where it used to be like, well, I know him, he was good at my club 5 years ago, we'll fix him, or he knows the league and therefore he'll be a great match regardless of what he's done this season already or last season, what the data says. It just allows you to basically not make that mistake. Maybe I'll show one more thing on the platform. I always think this is a really nice one from a data perspective. We often see recruitment departments going into an individual player in depth, thinking, okay, this guy is somebody we should really push now. I'll bring it to our head of recruitment or to the gaffer or to whoever else it might be and say, look, we've got to look at this guy. He's worth, I think, really considering. They then go and watch them, the head of recruitment or the gaffer, in the next match. And this is the game they watch them in, where he's essentially had his worst game of the season. And very often the work of the recruitment department will just go in the bin, and they'll be, we don't want to hear about him anymore. We know he's not right. To a certain extent, whoever's watched that game is right. They've seen, I guess objectively one of the worst wingers in the Eredivisie that season. But it's just not a representative picture of the entire season. I mean, you couldn't pick the worst game to go and watch him, but it's happened countless times. So don't let that be the reason that you kind of miss out on a play like this. I think we've added this feature very recently, which I think is really nice. There's an algorithm in the background that essentially looks at the 3 most representative matches of a player across the season. So if you want to dive into the video, it would say, okay, don't watch him in a random match. If you want a real picture of what he's done, watch him against Willem Svei, watch him against Cambuur and against Twente, and then you get a real picture of what he's likely to be able to perform across a full season without having to watch every individual match. Because from a data perspective, that epitomizes Lewis Sinistera as best as possible.
Again, that's fascinating, Robert. We're going to bring the pod to a close there, but it's been so enlightening to see and hear straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, about the work that IMPECT are doing. How can people who might want to find out more about IMPECT, how can they contact you?
That's a good question. I suppose we don't really do too much in public viewing. So I guess we have a website and we have an info app where people can contact us. They can also always contact me as well. I guess I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter for my sins. It's not the best of places at the moment from a football perspective, but yeah, they also feel free to reach out there.
Thousands of messages now, Robert, from fans all around the world. Dave just correct. You're going to get no sleep now after Dave's just said that. 0 sleep now. Thanks, Robert. That was absolutely brilliant. I think it's it's really important we highlight companies like yourselves that we think are trailblazers, essentially in what we all love, which is football.
No, thanks, guys. Really enjoyed it, and hopefully it'll go down well, and there'll be some people that gain some insights from it. Certainly felt like it was a pretty good run through of what we do and just data in general.
Definitely was that, Robert. So we appreciate your time, and we look forward to catching up with you soon when we start seeing other innovations. We're looking forward to the throw-in module being added, so we'll catch up on that when that comes out.
The room below me, they're working on it now, so I'm not sure what they come up with, but obviously there's a number of different things they kind of need to take into account. So we'll see. We're working with some set piece coaches from different clubs to try and understand what they kind of take into account. If you've got any ideas, feel free to throw them in the ring, because I think they're still in the concept phase. They keep on having to go back to the drawing board when they find out something else that's important.
Brilliant.
I'll probably see if they can they describe POMO. If they can describe POMO, they're still in it.
Good luck.
Thanks, Robert.
Cheers,
Ciao, guys.
Robert. Thank you, mate.